Welcome to the Dawn to Dusk podcast with your host, Douglas Wood, author of From Dawn to Dusk, How to Build a Multi-Million-Dollar Law Practice and Then Give It Away. In each episode, Doug speaks with distinguished legal professionals who have mastered the intricacies of building a successful law practice and then transitioning to retirement or other fulfilling pursuits when the right time comes. Now, let's join Doug for today's insightful discussion.
Today's guest is Noah Hanft, whose remarkable career spans nearly every dimension of the legal profession, from public service to corporate leadership to global conflict resolution. Noah began his legal journey as a legal aid attorney in Brooklyn, New York, representing indigent clients, a role that grounded his lifelong belief in access to justice and the human side of the law. He would go on to spend nearly 3 decades at Mastercard worldwide, ultimately serving as the company's General Counsel and Chief Franchise Officer, among other roles. During that time, he played a central role in transforming Mastercard from a consortium of financial institutions into a highly successful public company, overseeing the legal and regulatory strategy behind its groundbreaking IPO in 2006. Equally important, Noah helped shape Mastercard's collaborative culture, championing diversity, integrity, and the early use of mediation to resolve complex disputes. After leaving Mastercard, Noah entered what he calls his second career, serving as president and CEO of International Institute of Conflict Prevention and Resolution, CPR appropriately known as, where he advanced initiatives, approaches, and mediation and arbitration solutions worldwide. Today, he is the co-founder of Acumen ADR, a dispute prevention and resolution firm where he continues to serve as a mediator, arbitrator, executive coach, and advisor to companies and general counsel. But what stands out most is Noah's enduring belief that the highest form of leadership is collaboration, whether guiding a Fortune 500 company through transformation, helping parties find common ground, or mentoring the next generation of legal leaders. In our conversation today, we'll explore Noah's journey from the dawn of service and advocacy to the dusk of reflection and resolution. We'll talk about how he built, how he led, and how he continues to help others resolve conflict with clarity, empathy, and purpose. Noah, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Delighted to be with you. And I really appreciate that overly kind introduction.
Well, no, there's a lot more. I mean, I looked at your bio and all the accomplishments you've had, and it's really absolutely fantastic. I want to get one thing right out of the way on the side, and that's your background, the photographs you have of the lion, the gorilla, the giraffes, and the zebras. As we talked earlier, that reflects the product of a couple of safaris you did in Africa, right?
Yeah, yes, it does. And I get this question a lot because people assume that I know what I'm doing in terms of photography, and I'm the worst. But I had my iPhone and just took these photographs, and they came out kind of okay. So I'm proud of them. But the experience in Africa, as I was mentioning earlier, Doug, is just extraordinary. Trekking in Rwanda and visiting the gorillas was like a really life-changing experience for me. Just incredible.
I know it's on a lot of people's bucket list, so maybe they'll be inspired seeing your photographs. And obviously, this ought to be an advertisement for iPhones because those photographs look as good as any professional would ever do. So let's get to the subject matter of the podcast, which is this dawn to dusk evolution that lawyers of our ilk have gone through or are going through. Let's go back to the beginning. And you started your legal career with the Legal Aid Society. What made you go in that direction? And how did that influence your set of values as a lawyer and a leader at the time?
Well, I guess to answer that question, believe it or not, it comes back to Abraham Lincoln. From my childhood years, I was and remain an extraordinary admirer of Lincoln. And I remember as being very young and reading about Lincoln the lawyer and his legal career and his trials. So from the time as early as I can remember, I wanted to be a trial lawyer. And I also wanted to help the poor and the underrepresented. And the other driver for me was I really wanted to try cases. I do have a competitive side in addition to a collaborative side. And I heard stories about folks in law firms being in conference rooms, looking at documents for years. And I wanted to get into the courtroom. So legal aid gave me the opportunity to really kind of fulfill, two needs. One was really this commitment to helping the poor and the indigent, and also at the same time getting into court.
So you did that for a couple of years, if I'm not mistaken, and then made the leap eventually to in-house, ultimately at Mastercard. How did you go from the transition of dealing with indigent, individuals in need, in dire need, quite often in a lot of trouble, who needed your help, to working for a large corporation with its own different standards and issues?
Well, from the time I was young, my dad always encouraged me to kind of go where your interests lie and not worry so much about plotting your career. And so legal aid was the place I wanted to go. And the second interest I had was in the IP space. My dad was in advertising. I didn't want to work at an ad agency, but I was fascinated by trademark and copyright law. So while at legal aid, I went to school at night and got an LLM from NYU in trade regulations. And that kind of led me, after actually I was 5 years at legal aid, and started having kids. And I decided career-wise, I needed to go in a different direction, and also follow an area that I was interested in. So I joined an IP firm after, or right at the end of my course at NYU. There's an interesting common thread in my career progression, because I answered an ad in the Law Journal. Believe it or not, that's how far back it went. I answered an ad in the Law Journal for the IP job at a law firm, and coming from legal aid to a law firm was tough in those days. And after a couple of years at the law firm, I really became intrigued by the notion of working in a company and solving problems before matters became into or headed into litigation. So once again, I answered an ad in the Law Journal for the Mastercard role, and the ad literally said IP and Reg Z experience. I called up the recruiter and said, "I think I want this job." Well, he said, "How much Reg Z you have experience?" And it was before the internet. So I said, "I don't know what Reg Z is, but I'll just get me in. I'll get the job." And he did, and I got the job. And that was a very, very long time ago.
I can identify with that. When I was at NYU, as we discussed earlier, I got my LLM there as well. I saw a postcard on the bulletin board for a small firm that was looking for a clerk. It turned out to be Abel Clark and Osterberg, a pretty celebrated music litigation firm, and I was the second associate. They were literally only two partners there, and excuse me. So I spent a year there in rock and roll, like you wouldn't believe. I was going to clubs at night and all that kind of stuff. And I decided I had to get out of that, because if I stayed too long, I'd either become a drug addict or an alcoholic, or probably both, because it was just crazy. So like you did, I went into the Law Journal and I started looking for ads for law firms, because that's all we had then. We had Martindale Hubbell, which was the rating service, or the listing, and then you had the Law Journal. That was it. And so I saw this ad for a law firm, Paul Dickler. I answered the ad. I got interviewed for crazy reasons, and ultimately I got the job there. So, and a lot of younger lawyers today don't realize that the job search was in some ways a lot simpler back then.
Yes.
But also it was very limited. You didn't have a whole lot of resources you could go through to find a job. But it's interesting how our careers were so similar early on in the days. So one of the things I gathered from our discussions and reading up on you is that one of the things you were very proud of when you went to Mastercard was building a collaborative culture within the company. What did you encounter when you first got there that gave you that motivation to do that, and how did you start to implement that in the earlier part of the revolution?
Well, believe it or not, when I joined Mastercard, there were only 5 lawyers. I think there's probably close to 300 now today. So the organization has really grown over the years. But one of the things I realized early on was that the lawyers were like independent contractors. They had their areas, and it wasn't that they never spoke, but there really wasn't a cohesive, collaborative focus. And that kind of became a really important driver for me throughout my legal career, recognizing the benefit of, folks working as a team and really understanding what each of them do and how to achieve the best result for the client collectively.
Yeah, I could imagine that. Okay, you went from five, and now under your leadership as general counsel, eventually you probably had at least a couple hundred or more lawyers under your belt that you supervise and encourage to expand their careers. But one of the things that fascinates me about your career is that you were there when Mastercard itself transformed itself from a disparate set of different constituencies that were, banks and whatever they were. And you were there when they brought it into one cohesive company that today is obviously one of the largest and most influential financial institutions in the world on its own. What was that like doing that? And how did you interact with all the leadership and keep that collaborative spirit going then?
This was probably the most, fascinating initiatives during my legal career. And actually, there's a kind of a two-pronged effort. As you mentioned, Mastercard was really a consortium of financial institutions around the world, kind of loosely affiliated. And in Europe, Europay had Eurocard, which was a separate entity. So the first phase was Mastercard acquiring Europay, which became Mastercard Europe and is now, obviously part of a global company. So I think integrating, that team, and, I think when a company acquires another company, there's sometimes a tendency, to view it as like the occupied country, if you will. Maybe an extreme way of saying it, but, I think we really went the opposite way in showing respect to the individuals. In my case, it was the European attorneys that we acquired. But I think following that, I think there was a realization that, there was incredible power in the Mastercard brand and the network. And, there was a lot of legal challenges from the bank ownership of Mastercard. It was viewed by regulators and class action lawyers as essentially a walking conspiracy, in that every decision that Mastercard made was, as a legal matter, viewed as competitors getting together, and so the Mastercard strategy, if you will, was a part business and part legal strategy. And the idea was to figure out a way to avoid this legal exposure and convince the financial institutions that it was in their interest to go along with the IPO. That was really, really difficult. The banks had a very strong feeling, particularly in Europe, that if public shareholders control the company, they might go in different directions. They might not be so much for supporting, credit cards, but go into other businesses. There was this overriding fear of public ownership. So my role was to convince all of these leaders around the world that it was in their business interest to do this, and certainly in their legal interest because of the legal exposure. And one of the things I learned, and this I will never forget, one of the directors in Europe sat me down after one of my trips where I made this big speech, and he said, "Great job, but if you want to really change the thinking, you have to come back and then come back again, sit down, have a glass of wine, and come back again, and really, really show people that you really care about them, and they'll come around." And sure enough, it worked, and we ended up getting a unanimous vote of the European directors for the transaction. So it was, for those of us that follow the company, the results of the IPO were extraordinary. And the company now is, an incredibly valuable company. And one other unique aspect of the of the IPO was I'd say a creative solution that we came up with to address that concern that I mentioned about the public shareholders. And that was to create an ownership structure where the majority of the ownership initially was not with the public. The public had 49%, and the banks had 41%, and 10% went to a independent foundation, a charitable foundation based in Canada. No one knew that 10% would really be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So that foundation contributes to microfinance in Africa. It's the largest foundation, I believe, in Canada. And it was all as a result of a creative solution to address the concerns, and also a philanthropic benefit, which actually gave the company some significant credit for really helping societies around the world.
Well, I didn't know that aspect of the IPO. That's fascinating, and Mastercard should tell the world a little bit more about that, because they're doing some really incredible stuff in that regard. But the one thing you said there that really caught me was your experience with the Europeans. I remember when I was a young attorney and I went to a meeting in Europe, in Finland in this particular instance, and I was all fired up with this whole thing that I was going to solve and everything else. And the general counsel of the company in Finland took me aside, and it's sort of the same kind of a speech, said, Doug, it's really great what you presented and stuff, but we barely know you. So we're not going to do anything until and he goes, don't be a cowboy. The Americans are cowboys. We don't need cowboys here. We need people who get to know us and take time, because we've been around a lot longer than your country. So you don't have to speed up so fast. So it was a whole different kind of an experience for me to learn about, you can't just take your values and your thought process or your whatever it is and just expect other people to follow it, particularly when you realize that from an historical standpoint, we're just children as a country in this world. And there's others who have, really had a history that's far more interesting and complex than ours. And you often forget that when you're an American, but that's neither here nor there in this discussion. All right. So you had a 30 some odd year career at Mastercard. And at some point, you decided, okay, enough of this or whatever. Can you take us through that process of when you made that decision, what precipitated it, and how you felt about it from both a professional and an emotional standpoint?
So after the IPO, I was approached by the then CEO, and frankly congratulated for the initiative and for making it happen. And he asked me whether I wanted to take on a business role or continue as general counsel and take on some additional business units. And I did not want to give up the legal side of the business. So that's where the law and franchise integrity came from, that unit where I was chief franchise officer. So we actually included a number of business units, including fraud detection, licensing, franchise management, diversity, and philanthropy under my umbrella. So I worked hard to kind of unify that team as the law and franchise integrity group. So I did that for a number of years. And frankly, as I approached, after 25 years in the company, I was starting to think about, what to do next. But actually, what influenced me the most was we had a lot of litigation. I call it legacy litigation from pre-IPO days, and we had one particularly challenging mediation, and Ken Feinberg was the mediator. And we had a very, I think, productive mediation session. And I really became enamored with the process. And I had the audacity to say to Ken at the end of the session, I think I want to do what you do. What's your advice for me? And he's been a mentor ever since. He's given me advice. And I started actually mediating cases in the Southern District of New York while I was general counsel. And I decided that would be my next step. And so my plan was to leave Mastercard eventually, and just set up my own mediation arbitration shop. But I guess and I really believe this. Career-wise, I think it's really important to go as life leads you. So I was actually giving a talk on dispute resolution when in the audience was the recruiter for the CPR Institute that you mentioned in my introduction, the International Institute for Conflict Prevention and Resolution. And he approached me about, running the organization, which I initially declined. And then they came back and we talked about it, talked to my kids, two of whom were lawyers, and they encouraged me to do it because it's a great organization. It was an opportunity to speak around the world about the benefits of ADR. For example, we did a lot of work trying to drive the adoption of mediation in Brazil, which is the most litigious environment, I think, in the world, and also mediation in Scandinavia, which was unheard of. So in addition, we had a dispute resolution services organization that we grew, and we grew membership, and it was a great experience. I did that for 5 years. And then ultimately with a partner, we launched Acumen ADR, which, as you mentioned, is an opportunity for me to engage in a diverse set of activities, obviously arbitration and mediation, but I also do executive coaching and consulting. One of the things at this point in my career I really like is the diversity of work. So I love sitting as an arbitrator. I love resolving conflict in mediation setting. I really enjoy working with new general counsels and helping companies with dispute prevention and resolution challenges.
You talked about that distinction there, and I noticed in some of the things I've seen you talk about over the years, the difference between dispute resolution and dispute prevention. In many lawyers' minds, they don't think about the prevention side. They think about a lot about the resolution side, whether it's litigation, arbitration, mediation, whatever it is. But tell us how you help not get there by using the prevention lens with your clients and companies you consult.
Yeah. So, Doug, I'm going to be really candid with you. When I left Master, we were very focused on dispute resolution. I changed the name of the litigation department to the dispute resolution department, really focused on mediation and resolving disputes in a thoughtful way. And obviously, there's budgetary advantages to that. When I joined CPR, I read this body of literature about dispute prevention and how you can actually, like, for example, in joint ventures, where I think there's like a 60% fail rate. And I thought back to joint ventures that we did, and many of them don't work. And when you do a joint venture, I'm sure there's like the two companies have like a product management committee and even a regulatory committee, in any number of committees, but no focus on how to deal with disputes. And the concept is, if you address areas of friction early, they don't metastasize into full-blown disputes. And that really is what the prevention concept is, that you actually recognize the inevitability of business conflict, but you get ahead of it by setting up mechanisms to deal with the inevitable situation. And one of the most common uses of this is in the construction field, where you really don't have time to litigate or arbitrate. You need decisions made right away. So there are, you can call them facilitators or, dispute prevention leaders. But these are folks that could be hired by, like, for example, a owner in a construction, setting, to actually work with the parties, even be at meetings, and recognize where there are areas of friction and just deal with them in a way that avoids conflict and lets the work go on. So this can take many different contexts, but the underlying concept is to be aware that disputes are likely to happen and figure out mechanisms to address the situation so they get addressed and companies can continue to do business.
It's interesting. You talk about the role of general counsel in dispute resolution and dispute prevention. That's one of the things that I always admired with great general counsel in companies, that they were very, very, very grounded in trying to find solutions, as opposed to, the outside counsel often wanting to take on the world and change everything and lose sight of what the real mission necessarily is, because they're not in-house. They're not living that environment day in, day out. And you obviously accomplished that at Mastercard. And now you're coaching new GCs or experienced GCs. What challenges do you see them facing today that are different? Has AI gotten involved? Has the remote aspect gotten involved? And what kind of challenges are you talking to GCs today about?
So that's a great question. In some ways, the more things changed, the same issues still exist. So yes, there are challenges with AI, and dealing with potentially shrinking staffs and the like. But I think what I would emphasize, and what I do emphasize with new general counsels and sometimes aspiring deputy general counsels, is to really understand what drives the business. Obviously, you really have to convince the executive team that even though you're a lawyer and you're a general counsel, you understand the business. That is like really, really important in the success of an in-house lawyer. But I think one of the key challenges that lawyers generally have, whether they're in-house or outside, is the absence of listening skills. And I have worked with so many attorneys, because when you take on a coaching assignment, you often do like a 360, speaking to their peers, their subordinates, and their managers. And one thing you hear so often is this individual has to dominate a conversation, has to dominate a room. He's brilliant, he adds a lot of value, but the lack of self-awareness is a real challenge. And I've gotten to the point where sometimes I'm really blunt, and my advice is just simply shut up and listen, because it really is a challenge. I mean, to be successful, that's important. Listening skills, empathy. When you're a general counsel, you're challenged because you're actually giving legal advice to friends. When you're in a company a long time, like I was, the clients are friends. You go to their, you go to their weddings, you go to their kids' weddings as you get older. So it really is important to be able to balance that with the ability to give, serious advice. I did jump from your question from coaching to helping lawyers understand how best to communicate with clients.
Well, it's funny. Another experience I had in my career, the same Finnish client, oddly enough. We went to Japan to negotiate a deal, and we're talking. The general counsel and I are talking to our Japanese counterparts across the table, and they're not saying anything. They're nodding their heads yes constantly, and they understood us. There was no issue with understanding us, and we left the meeting, and the general counsel said to me, "Well, nothing was accomplished there." And I go, "What do you mean?" They were nodding, and he goes, "Yeah, but that's what the art is. They just listen. They listen, they absorb, they listen. You watch what happens tomorrow when we go back, and now they'll start talking, and we'll see just how far apart we really are." And that ability to just be quiet and listen, as opposed to feel that you've got to interject something, otherwise you're not part of the meeting or you're not contributing, is a skill set that takes years to master, and to figure out that sometimes the best thing, as you said, is to just shut up and listen, which is a skill set that many lawyers, given their natural egos, are incapable of doing.
You mentioned something that I think is really important, and that is understanding the cultural differences. We Mastercard was a global company. It did business all around the world. So I'm dealing with banking regulators from countries all over the place. And I think what's really helped me in terms of, because I do a fair amount of cross-border mediation, international arbitration, and the like, is really understanding cultural differences. People are more the same than different, but there are differences in how people from different countries negotiate, for example. So to your point, it's quite important to understand and learn from those experiences.
Yeah, and it's also enriching and incredibly enriching to encounter that and to see that again, as I'm always reminded of the client in Finland who said, "Don't be a cowboy," and that's the American way. When we are, as I said earlier, we're the youngster in the world, so we've got a lot to learn as a culture. One of the things you mentioned a little earlier, you had a couple of your kids are lawyers and stuff, and without question, when you were traveling all over the world, running the legal department with hundreds of lawyers, time consuming, incredible amount of demands on you. How did you balance that with your family life?
That's a great question. It's a challenge I think we all have, those of us in legal roles, and I made a point of trying to miss as few events in their lives as I could. So I would take off from work and go to a gymnastics meet, swimming competition, whatever it was that the kids were doing and excited about. I wanted to be there. And I will never forget a conversation with my predecessor, General Counsel, who sadly has passed. But he said to me one day, he said, it's so good that you go, if I could do it over again, I miss so much of what my kids did growing up. And now, when he got older, he kind of reestablished relationships and the like. But when he said that to me, it made me want to even do that more because, looking back, how much he regretted, missing those experiences. So, you do all you can. Sometimes you have to miss stuff. But I think I remember talking to my kids fairly recently, and I said, I'm sorry I missed whatever I missed. And what was important to them was they knew I was making the effort, even if sometimes I couldn't get to a softball game or a gymnastics meet.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because the same experience I had. Two quick anecdotes. One time a client said to me, it's not the ones you go to that they most remember. It's the ones you missed that they most remember. And that really hit me. I said, well, I'm not going to miss a lot.
Yeah.
So I did crazy stuff. One time I took a couple of red eyes from Hawaii to see a play in New Jersey that my daughter was in. She was a sugar plum or some completely irrelevant role in this stage play. But I arrived, everything was delayed and everything. I arrived with in the middle of February with a Hawaiian shirt on and a pineapple. I arrived at the venue, and they asked me to please don't bring in the pineapple because it smelled so much. So I'm sitting in the audience looking like an idiot. And so, those experiences. But to this day, my daughter will say, "I remember when you had the pineapple." So it's those kinds of experiences that a lot of lawyers get caught up in, and they later come to regret it. The other thing that I'd love your comment on too is you have what are your other outside interests? Because one of the things I've seen with lawyers I've consulted with over the years on going into retirement or going into a different role or whatever it might be is that they don't have anything else to do, that they're kind of lost. They were so caught up in being a lawyer that they failed to recognize that there are other things in life beyond the law. How did you deal with that, and how would you give advice to other lawyers in that respect?
It's all about balance. I mean, truthfully, there are so many folks my age and your age that are truly retired. And I have a terrible golf game. So that wasn't going to be it for me. But I think, I love what I do, and it's important for me to find the fulfillment from that but also travel. It's all about travel. I love hiking and going to the theater, going to museums. I think it's really important that you enjoy life in a way that matters to you. And for me, I think I'm fortunate that I found work that really excites me, that gives me fulfillment, but also allows me to like schedule, time away so I can go on a vacation in Italy or Africa, as we talked about, or Patagonia. So I think, it is, I think, so important to have a life outside of work, regardless of what age you are, but particularly when you're able to, step away and have some free time. My wife would probably disagree that I'm taking as much time off as possible, to be candid, but I do really enjoy, traveling and spending some time away from the office.
I remember one time I traveled to the Caribbean and we sailed in the Caribbean and there was no internet service. There was no way I could connect with the world that I lived in professionally. And we did a 10-day sail throughout the Caribbean. And the plane is landing in Kennedy, and in those days it was the BlackBerry that we all had, and the messages started spinning like a gas tank. When you just spin. There were well over 1,000 messages that I had missed while I was in the ocean. And I landed. I started going through them, and I realized I'm never going to get through these. So I just hit the erase. I erased them all, being courageous. About 5 seconds after I erased them all, I was paranoid as hell. And oh my God, it's going to be terrible. I probably lost half my business, whatever. And I found out a few days later, it didn't make any difference. I wasn't as relevant as I thought I was.
Yeah.
And that there were people to support me. There were others who could pick up and deal with the issues that would happen. Clients were reasonable. Whatever. So that moment for me was where I said, you can have balance.
Yeah.
You just have to make the effort to do it. And you're right. You use the exact word, balance, which is hard to do.
You make a great point. I think I would call life goes on. Like, you think you're the center of the universe, and then you're away for a week and you kind of come back and, you're frantic and whatever. And then you kind of realize life goes on without you. The company, the world can survive if you take a couple of weeks off.
Right. Exactly. And now when you're in your point in your career where you're taking a lot of weeks off, you can fill it in with all sorts of stuff on your bucket list. That's sort of what I'm doing, is filling it with that. So, okay. Last lightning round question to you. Try to sum up in 10 seconds or whatever, 15 seconds, what the one lesson you'd like to say to lawyers who are approaching the later term of their career, and what to look forward to and how to deal with it.
It's no different than the advice I give young lawyers. It really is follow your interests, find fulfillment in what you do, and enjoy yourself.
Well, that enjoy yourself is the part that I think is sometimes the biggest challenge, but the best piece of advice that you can give. So Noah, thank you very much for being on the program. I know there was some great insight that the viewers and listeners will take for themselves and to hopefully take it to heart. So thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you. Delighted to be with you.
Thank you for joining us on the Dawn to Dusk podcast. You can learn more on building and transitioning a multi-million-dollar law practice in Doug's book, From Dawn to Dusk, How to Build a Multi-Million-Dollar Law Practice and Then Give It Away. If you're interested in working with Doug, suggesting future guests, or have questions you'd like Doug to ask guests in upcoming episodes, reach out to him at douglas.wood@wood.law or visit his website at dawntodusk.wood.law. And if you enjoyed the podcast, don't forget to subscribe and share it with your peers. Until next time, we appreciate your viewership.